I think that the Vita and the Count have really trickled into the cultural conversation in a big way this year, perhaps more than other years, maybe just by repetition. And it's kind of sparked all these other conversations, not only about book reviewing, but about women and sexism and literature. For instance, when Claire Massoud was asked in an interview, Publishers Weekly interviewer said to her, I would want to be friends with your main character. And she said something along the lines of, are you crazy? You know what? You don't read books to like people. And no, she said, what kind of a question is that? Okay, that was, what kind of question is that? And a lot of, then there was a raging argument, is it sexist to have said this to her? Is it sexist to think that a woman writer's character should be likable? I mean, does Jonathan Franzen get the same criticism? I think maybe he does. And in fact, he gets personal criticism. Maybe he's not very likable. Is this all part of the same debate? And, do you guys have any thoughts about that?
I have a sort of tangential one. I think it's also about the language that writers use about each other. That male writers tend to use hyperbolic language when talking about other male writers, like throwing around genius and writer of generation, just kind of overly bombastic language when helping each other out, whereas I think women tend to be more measured. I just noticed this because my wife writes the book review column for Vanity Fair, and she's also a writer, and she's been talking a lot to fellow writers and critics, and comparing language, and sort of making a concerted effort to use kind of more masculinist language when trumpeting other women's books, because it's I think men have an easier time using that kind of language.
I guess one of the things I've noticed is that I do think that women have to take responsibility for how they want to participate in literary culture. I do think, anecdotally, I don't have any numbers for this, but I do think anecdotally women sometimes will be resistant to entering into the critical conversation. That does, I suspect the numbers might bear that out. But I also think it's worth pointing out that when a woman steps into that culture, it's the elbows get thrown, but they get thrown especially hard at women who are in any kind of public position, putting any kind of opinion out there. So I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but as long as we live in a culture where there's such a kind of, which is funny because it's literature, but there's a weirdly macho stank around the whole culture of it. And I know a lot of reviewers and who are like male friends by day, and then they turn into these testosterone-fueled, elbow-throwing. I mean, sometimes it's not a civilized conversation. And not that there shouldn't be energy and vitality and that people don't always have to just say, oh, you're fabulous all the time. But there is something about, and I'm not a sociologist and I don't have the numbers on this either, but I do think there have been times in the past before Vita started where I was often asked to review things and I just didn't want the pain, right? I did not want to get attacked in the ways that I've been attacked before. And in really, really personal ways. And I know a lot of women, just simply publishing books, I've been, my fitness as a mother has been called into question. Just the things that make you just think, what, you're talking about my kid? You're talking about my kid in a review. Or, or what was yours? Like, I wouldn't want to be Kate Marvin's boyfriend. Right, in a review. So it just seems like there's a different, sometimes, I'm not saying always, but I'm saying sometimes it does seem like there's a different standard and a different kind of approach when a woman does put herself out there. And now I don't know that we in this room can fix that today, and maybe the answer to that will be women just developing more of a callus. That's what we've had to do, and just say, well, if it's meaningful to me, if it's valuable to me, I'm gonna take the lumps, and then maybe the culture is gonna change and it won't be that way as much. But it's hard to run toward the thing, especially now in the internet age where the comment box has become the most pernicious space, virulent space, right? I mean, our friend Deb, right? Like if you look at what Deb Kopak-Kogan did in that piece in The Nation, some of you probably saw her talking about her experience, my so-called feminist life. What was really brutal to see wasn't, people had reactions to her piece that were so blatantly misogynistic, right, in the comment box, where they felt free to write the most awful things that you can imagine in response to what she was saying. And then the piece that our friend Scott wrote about in Higher Ed Today, where a woman was writing about rape and how the language of rape needs to change, and someone responded by saying, well, that she needed to basically be raped.
Oh my God.
And so as long as we live in a world where it's okay to talk to women that way, as long as we live in a world where, the worst thing you can be on the playground is a pussy, right? The worst thing that little boys can think to identify with is girls. That, it's not going to change very much. If it's a bigger question, that's what's going on in the panel. But we can't fool ourselves that, well, women just have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and write more criticism. I think it's a larger issue than that.
Yeah, that's for sure. I just want to say something a little bit about the experience I've had as a critic trying to weigh something that you're talking about, which is the elbow throwing, against something else. By definition, right, your job as a critic is to take a critical stance on something. It's not necessarily to tell other people how to feel, but it is certainly to state in no uncertain terms, to the extent that you yourself understand it, how you feel about things. This is not a role that it is popular for women to have in our culture in any context. God forbid you even weigh in on, an outfit, right? Actually, that may be the one thing you probably are allowed to weigh in on. But, so on the one hand, I feel like, it is clear to me that the thing that I feel like I have the most right to in this world is my own opinions, right? And a kind of intellectual place at the table, and I feel strongly about that, and I'm willing to throw some elbows, and I'm willing to have elbows thrown at me. I do think it's important to develop that ability in ourselves, in our daughters, and our sisters, and in all the women and girls around us. On the other hand, I don't think that that's the be-all and end-all of criticism. And one of the things that I think is interesting that I never really hear talked about in conversations about gender and criticism and gender in the literary world is that I actually think that women, in a certain sense, have an imaginative advantage coming into this world and this job for an unfortunate reason, which is that by the time you are old enough to read a chapter book, if you are a little girl, you know how to cross-identify, right? And that goes double if you're a person of color, and it goes double if you're queer, right? By the time I was 9, I could identify with Taran Wanderer and little King Arthur and the Once and Future King. This is something that girls, because the vast body of the cultural products shared with us are about boys and feature boys in the desirable roles, we learn very easily how to kind of move imaginatively among characters like that. I think it's actually incredibly good for us intellectually and imaginatively. I think it's good for us as critics. I think it's good for us as writers. I think it's probably good for us in terms of empathy as human beings. And it's not actually something that I want to entirely set aside as a critic in sort of entering into this elbow throwing arena. And so one of the real challenges, I think, is I'm actually not a kind of barn burner, and I'm not, I don't.
The author's dead.
Unless the author is dead. There may be an occasional exception in there, but for the most part, my intellectual instincts tend toward, I'm interested in things that are complicated. I'm interested in things that I have complicated feelings about. And that doesn't really lend itself to these sort of bombastic reviews or to the you're a genius, you're a genius, you're a genius. There are not actually very many geniuses in the world. Be a book reviewer for 1 year, what we're going to be very sad about is the lack of geniuses, right? It is, I think, very tricky to figure out how to enter into that world. And you're absolutely right. Obviously, the answer isn't ladies, grab your bootstraps and make a place for yourself at this table. And I didn't mean to suggest as much. On the other hand, I think that one of the things we really all, do need to do to the extent that we can is figure out what we actually think is a valuable voice and nurture it in ourselves and the people around us. building on that and elaborating on what I said earlier about having women write about different kinds of subjects and review different kinds of books. Just a personal anecdote, when I was a freelancer for the book review, which I did, I think, for 7 years before I came on staff, the assignments were generally made by preview editors, so I would get what I would get. And at one point, I got a book, and I think that this is the review I'm most proud of in retrospect. It was a very, very bad political, economic tract, and it was assigned to me, I think 2 weeks after the birth of my second child. And after the birth of my first child, I had reviewed a book, and it was a lovely book about a panda. I thought, oh, I could have totally do that while nursing and being up all night with the baby. So I took this on. The moment I said yes to the review, my then 4-week-old baby woke up, who had been sleeping peacefully until then, and went through a period of total horrible near colic and sleeplessness. And this was at the same time that I was reviewing this very bad political economic theory book. And I constantly questioned myself. I wanted to be so thorough with this book. I wanted to make sure that I knew exactly what I was talking about. I even asked the editor at one point, why did you assign this to me? Because it wasn't the kind of book that I was accustomed to be given. But in the end, I think that I was much more diligent with that book. I handed in a very negative review. I even took care to have that compassion and to say, this is an extremely negative review, I realize, and I've gotten very little sleep in the last few weeks, and every moment that I wasn't kept awake by a screaming baby, I was reading this god-awful book and trying to write about it in a fair way, and I want to be sure, do you think that I've given this book, its fair due, and didn't take it all out on this book author. And he said, no, that he thought it was a terrible book as well, and that I had been fair. But I think that I don't necessarily know that, and you can only generalize so much, but I don't know that every male reviewer would have necessarily sort of struggled that much over whether I knew, all of the background. I wanted to make absolutely sure that I was criticizing him fairly, that I knew what I was talking about, and in the end, I think that I probably gave it a much stronger review, not a positive one, but a much stronger, better review than other reviewers may have done.
Back to the likability issue a little bit, because I think it speaks to sort of larger things, which is about how we write. And just as a fiction writer, not as a critic, looking at that, of course there are books with wonderfully likable characters, books that we love, Howard's End and Jane Austen novels and all kinds of novels. You have to write the book that you want to write, really. But I have heard again and again from women who've said that they have specifically been told by editors who are considering their books, she's not likable enough, even if that wasn't the point of the book, as though it was meant to be a friendship, sort of like people who go to therapy to make a friend, and so I've heard tell. Some of what happens if it boils down to being about likability is you're losing what a novel can do, which is create a whole world, empathy, understanding of people who you might not feel comfortable around, or worlds you might not know. And I guess I see it as my responsibility as a writer to sort of write the book I want to write. And Mary Gordon, who was my first writing teacher, said something, which is that you should write what's important. And I think what's sort of implied there is what's important to you. And if women writers start to feel in some way, or have felt, that what is passionate to them will be seen as small, if they have to make it more fun, and that's not the book that they wanted to write. If it was meant to be fun and that's what they wanted to do, of course they should write that book. But they have to feel that if what engages them, and they're a wonderful writer, if they do that, they have to have a shot. They have to have a real shot at being able to enter that cultural conversation. I mean, nobody ever said, to my knowledge, said to Philip Roth, write a book called Zuckerman Nice. It just didn't happen. So.
Does anyone have questions? Laurie?
I'm so glad you said that, Meg, because you will write all the crap you want, write the bitterest, nastiest women in the world. you'll find critics like me will say, this is great, this belongs in the public conversation. You know, there will be people to say, I love this book. It doesn't have to be, you know, everybody in the world. I just think it's so important to have the courage to keep writing. And it's true, you know, the people who supported the stuff that nobody else wanted to read did change the public conversation slowly, little by little. It's horrifying to me that this is still going on, this kind of panelism is still happening, but if it is, it is. So I just want to say, you know, there are critics, and I hope that I'm one of them.
Laurie Stone reviewed my first book,
Yes, I did.
The Village Voice, and I was so excited. Back when The Village Voice was this big thing, it came out on Wednesdays, and you would rush out to see, did you see The Voice? You know, it was sort of like that.
Well, one of the things is we didn't have to care if anybody thought, you know, we didn't care if anybody thought women's work was important or not. We were making the Cultural Revolution, we were making it in the paper, we were making it, you know, on the streets, we were making it in the criticism, and it did work to some degree. I mean, I can't believe we didn't change absolutely everything in the culture completely, apparently we didn't, but we thought we were going to. We thought that this kind of conversation was never going to be happening in 2013, really. But it did also happen that lots and lots and lots of women writers who might not have felt the courage to write the kind of characters that they wanted, or get publishers for themselves, or get recognized in any publication by critics, did find critics to support them and say, this is the stuff that we need to have added to the public conversation. It's coming from art, it's coming from literature, it's coming from performance, it's coming from women artists. And that women isn't a dirty word. It's not a thing that marginalizes you. It's a thing that puts the shine on. You know, let's hear what these people have to say now. So I think I'm making a speech. Goodbye.
So I have a fear. I also instinctively look at who, you know, how many women there are on in the table of contents, and it causes me pain. But I have a theory, and I'm interested in your response to it about what's going on a little bit in the kind of internet age. And I'm going to make a lot of gaffes and generalizations in the process. But yeah, okay, I'll talk as loud as I can. So it seems to me, I'm particularly interested in reading reviews on fiction, and it seems to me those have, particularly in places like the New York Review of Books, have shrunk in serious places where there are long pieces, and that's an area where women have, because they're readers of fiction, have tended to write on, and it seems to me like a larger proportion of reviews are written on nonfiction, on things that are kind of hard science. And my thinking is that it has something to do with of social media and the fact that we have things like Goodreads, which I actually enjoy, and where people have opinions, lots of opinions, and so the thought is, well, if they're doing that, what's a review to do? And so the area in which, and that's an area where women are sort of highly represented. So I was wondering if there, and I'll add that my feeling is also, and it may just be because I'm reading them more closely, that reviews have spent too much time on plot. Way too much time. And that's some sort of weird, perverse reaction to the fact that Goodreads can do opinion. So now what are we going to do? We're going to do plot. Instead of like, we're going to do serious ideas, we're going to take this up. I mean, I think very few people read books simply for plot. It's much more involved than that. Okay.
Is one of the things that you're saying that you feel that there's a distinction here where men are sort of more and more frequently heading toward nonfiction and the reviewing of nonfiction, and women seem to be on the fictional side of publication and review?
I think someone said that most of the, Meg Wolitzer said that most of the readers of, that the largest percentage of readers of fiction are women. So if you shrink the number of fiction reviews, you're shrinking that audience, you're shrinking those writers, because writers write about what they read, etc.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify.
I actually have a...
Kate has a comment.
I think you're on something. I think we've noticed that with nonfiction that... Sorry, I don't really want to stand up. We've noticed that when you break down the numbers of nonfiction, it's like way more skewed toward men. There's many more men, especially when you look at awards and best of lists. It's always much bigger. Like, you know, like male authors know more about nonfiction, right? And when I have looked at Goodreads, which is something I really want to investigate further, it seems that there's like a lot more readers.
Just step in front of
No, you're not going to be able to hear me. I don't
Step in front of the podium.
Oh, the podium.
It doesn't work.
Just take the little microphone.
That's an important point about nonfiction.
This is getting kind of embarrassing. So I'm going to get off the stage in a millisecond. But with the count, we actually have our count coordinator with us today in the room. Is Jen Fitzgerald here? But anyway, it's whenever we look, we break down the different genres, which is something we did from the very, very beginning. And it's really interesting to look at how poetry, for example, usually there's more women represented. But in nonfiction, and of course in children's books, there's always way more women. But with nonfiction, there's predominantly male authors, whether they are reviewed or they're getting awards for their work. With Goodreads, it's really interesting to look at Goodreads because you're right, it's a completely different arena where women, there's way more women represented on Goodreads. And so I think that sort of looking at that venue is really important. I think that's something that we should undertake.
And somebody else was pointing out that they feel like there's a correlation between traditional sort of prestige markers and how women are represented. So when you have the kind of, I guess, egalitarian community of Goodreads, right, it makes sense to me that women would be represented much more strongly there. Whereas if you look at, somehow we have this sort of idea of what our pecking order of prestige outlets is, right? And the more prestigious the space, the fewer female voices there are. It's like, you know, women can talk all they want, they just can't necessarily get into that idea of the elite spaces.
Correlation with awards, men getting higher monetary awards. Right.
I just want to say something quickly about that, which is that it does suggest to me that the only real answer here, short of like, you know, rebooting our entire culture without sexism, which is not going to happen, actually is a structural answer. And I take my hat off to Rob for that. Like, I actually think the only way this is going to change is when people on top take it seriously and put in metrics and say, they're measuring it, we're going to measure it, and we are actually going to make that shift happen. And that should be a measurement. I mean, we measure what we think matters. Right now we're measuring women, and I'll tell you what, there's a lot else we should be measuring out there too, for sure, starting with people of color in the literary community. That one, like, we just dropped it, right? I don't know if we think it doesn't matter or if we think the problem is so overwhelming there's no hope of solving it, but there should be metrics for that too, and I really don't see the solution happening without it being systematically, like, you know, institutionalized at every single one of these magazines.
Well, but let me ask a question for both of you. One of the big responses to, I see you, Sarah, hang on just a second. One of the big responses that people say to that is, well, the quality will just go to hell. I mean, if we start putting in the quotas and we're just publishing women because they have vaginas, just to have our numbers be what they are, all literary culture will die.
I'll tell you what, why don't we just try that experiment?
I haven't seen any drop in, like, I'm still getting the same number of Best American Stories, same O. Henry Award, same Pushcart Prize. I mean, it's not a matter, the quality is out there, it's just a matter of you know, getting it to me. I'm reacting to what is sent to me, and I haven't seen any drop in quality. And I'm kind of frankly baffled by my fellow editors, the reactions they have to the Vita count, especially at places like Harper's, which was, what, 93% this year? You know, 93% male writers, and they were like, oh, we're just publishing good writing, you know, like, oh, the best, yeah, the best. You know, it's like, really? Like, I mean, like, I can see 60-40. That could be an unconscious thing, but 93-7, that means that you were just sort of willfully ignoring women and not assigning, it's not even on your radar.
You know, it's just sort of reminding me of something back around the time of the women's movement and afterwards, if some of you are old enough to remember this, women's magazines published great fiction. This is gone from the culture now. This was a really important thing. On one page you could have a recipe for heavenly Jell-O surprise. On the next page you have a story by Joyce Carol Oates. And this was it was folded into the culture. Good fiction, you would come upon that, and we're missing that now. And that was another important outlet, and it was sort of everywhere. Red Book, all of those magazines, and we've lost that. And
Articles in general.
yeah, but fiction in particular really had a place so that it did not have to only be in what were considered the elite places. It had a place. I think we live in a nonfiction culture, which also is a male culture in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Sarah was trying to speak to her point.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a master's student here at Master's Lab. I've kind of forgotten what I was going to say, but I was basically talking along the lines of representation and the idea of really spokespersonship. Like, I feel like every time I say something or I write something, it's like, oh, the black chick is talking. You know, like, do you guys feel like that works in like genre? You know, like, or like, basically I'm asking, how does it feel to be a problem or a rock star or like a representation of all like women superstars or something, like, and I also have a general comment about like because of the way, like, I piggyback on the idea that a lot of these things are structural, you know, like, I like, literally when I hand in essays in college classes, teachers look at me like, word, yo, like, you can read? Like they're so surprised at the quality of my writing, like, because they're like, wait a minute, wait, she can read, like, the same kind of thing, like, when Obama was elected, everybody was like, wait a minute, he's articulate. Oh, like, that was like an article, like, he was articulate, like, that was their shocking, like, fact. So, like, I think, like, a lot of problems are really systemic, and, you know, like, even, like, things as simple as, like, public libraries, you know, like, the public library in Canarsie in my neighborhood, there's barely any books in there. Like, we have computers and chairs, because, like, we sit around and, like, plot criminal activity at the table in the library. But there's no, like, real, like, readership or, like, book clubs and, like, writing clubs and all the things that are available in the communities out here are not really in like, the African American community, speaking as an African
Sarah, I wonder if you feel, one of the things that we felt like has been a really positive thing about the Vita conversation has been that, you know, women include, and we at Vita have been extremely conscious of making sure that we mean women across every spectrum. You know, every color, every flavor, every version of woman is involved, very, very much involved with what we're doing. So I'm wondering if you feel that the conversation for people, and, you know, for people of color, do you feel like this conversation has been regalvanized, reignited? Do you feel like that you're encountering the conversation changing or growing in any way, or does it still feel the same to you?
I feel like it's changing because, like, me and my friends used to joke about the feminist movement, like we were talking about the women's movement, and we were like, yeah, the black woman held your kids and took care of your kids while you went and did your feminist thing and barbering. So, like, now we feel more like it's integrated in, like, you know, like everybody is a part of, like, structural change, and, like, that is important, like, validating practice. Cool.
Oh, I just wanted to pick up on something I heard earlier. To ask, I'd like to pick up on a comment that I heard earlier, and I want to ask, what can you do further? Can you push the idea further? So there was a comment that women critics take control. So the idea was like there should be more women critics who should take control of the literary conversation. But to be pragmatic, there's like a tricky balance, because sometimes to be considered serious critic, you have to review more male writers. So if you set aside the fact that there are some places where there are indeed editors or publishers that make structural changes to how they perceive the literary landscape. So given that there's that, does the lone critic in such a venue, is there a possibility to implement that structural change, or do you just give balance? Live with the balance? B, is there a way to really push forward the conversation? What about, I mean, by now, there has been a lot, we already in many ways stake out a conversation on gender and criticism. So where does, I mean, we're a little bit further along. Where does the critic position himself in such a situation?
Having made that comment about women critics taking more control over the conversation, I should probably own a little bit and try to explain. And as I said, I do ultimately think that isn't the answer. I think the answer is structural. And I'll give you a fairly glaring example of why. I started out by saying that I am not the book editor, I'm the book critic, and I have complete autonomy to write about what I choose. That is true, and I love it. It's one of the things I love most about my job. My editors are wonderful. They are literally the best colleagues I've ever had. I adore them professionally and personally. And it was not until I ran the Vita numbers on myself and my predecessor last night that I realized that there is a problem with that, which is that he also had absolute autonomy to write about whatever he wanted. And in a sense, I fault him far less than I fault my very beloved editors, because the fact is nobody at that magazine ever stepped back and said, wait a second, actually, like, we need to track this thing and we need to adjust course here.